Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Keeping Up with the Cloud Problem Nobody is Talking About. I'd like to welcome two distinguished panelists that are making significant contributions to innovations in the cloud, especially on the Kubernetes front. Our first panelist, Shlomo Bielak, VP of Engineering at The Score. He's a seasoned exec and a thought leader very focused on the human element in delivering effective and efficient solutions in the cloud. Our second panelist, Nair, CEO and co-founder at Avesha. He is a serial entrepreneur and an innovator credited with delivering the first internet load balancer. This was back in 1997, called ArrowPoint. Avesha products help run Kubernetes workloads efficiently and cost-effectively in any cloud, leveraging the power of AI and reinforcement learning. I'm your host, Dheeraj Raula, Head of Customer Success at Avesha. Today's topic for the webinar is about the challenges of delivering SLOs and SLAs in the cloud, despite having a host of tools and data sets and infrastructure that's available to you. Welcome, Shlomo. Welcome, Raj.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That brings us to the first question, right? There's a whole host of APM products out there. Access to metrics and data across every layer in the infrastructure for applications deployed in the cloud. Shlomo, this question's for you. Are you able to do something to help your SREs with intelligent remediation with respect to maintaining an SLA in the cloud?
So I think most organizations have a preventative measure that they put in place. So for example, many organizations know of events that are coming, they prepare for them, they put a task force and a plan together, and teams work around the clock, additional to their current workload, and build the resilience for that event. It has some disadvantages, which is it draws on people more than it should, especially if you have lots of events. And it basically increases your costs because you're doing it prior to the event. And then the work effort after the event also exists. The reason being is there are technology gaps when it comes to scaling specific application requirements and the downstream effects of that currently based on technology, which is why we're working with Avesha right now.
Awesome. So there's a deluge of tools and data. You still need to kind of make sense out of it, I guess. Right?
Look, a lot of the engineers on the front lines, which I do consider to be front lines, you have healthcare front lines and you have technology front lines. It's quite stressful. For the events that are predicted, it's wait. For the events that are unpredicted, it's stress. So I think having a solution that covers both of them would be a benefit in both circumstances.
Awesome. So what is the most pressing need that you see, right? With how do you use this data besides just for planning for things?
I think it changes the mindset that most organizations use. In the past, people used VMware to prevent applications from failing using DRS and vMotion. With cloud native, you have scaling that goes nodes and horizontally as pods. And what essentially happens is you can scale without actually creating resilience per CPU. Like you should be evaluating how effective your systems are. And until a solution is made, pretend you have constraints, because one, there are financial constraints, but most organizations don't handle those very well. So there's a financial side to this that occurs. So if you interpret how you're using the system, where just because I can do something doesn't mean it's the right way to do it, I think having things scaled correctly for SLOs and then reacting to meeting those SLOs in a predictive manner is really what we should be after. The challenge is we're scaling bigger and bigger to solve resilience challenges. And I think we've been doing our utmost to get the best out of every CPU and make sure that we're heading towards a very unimpactful human event when there are significant events for our business.
All right, it's almost like the problem with the plentiful, right? It seems like there's an unlimited supply, so you kind of fall into this trap of not really kind of taking this more carefully. With that, I mean, do you see any tools out there that look promising, that help you with some of these decisions?
I mean, we've looked together with Avesha at your smart scaler capabilities where you can predict and create a service map of your service and how it needs to scale together. So I didn't touch on it, but essentially there are services that are dependent on each other. There's no microservices system that isn't related to another microservices system. So cloud native, while it simplifies monoliths failing, it complicates the interdependencies of ratios between systems needed to scale. And that is where you need help. Humans aren't good at managing that level of complexity in a stressful scenario. Even without the stressful scenario, it's really complicated. So that is where technology does a really good job. It can crunch numbers for you and take your business requirements and implement them without you having to be there under pressure.
Right. Raj, I mean, this is probably an area where I think that's been a focus for us, right? Is kind of solving the human element, because as we moved from monoliths to microservices and kind of harness the power of being able to scale more efficiently, we also introduced more knobs, right? More data, more knobs, more things to kind of fine tune. And the problem of a human trying to do this, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, the approach we have taken is different than what others have, and where we are looking at the data, we're looking at historical data for application behavior, and then from that data, using the tools that we have now, the ML and in particular reinforcement learning, which is the heart of generative AI, right? And so it's a semi-supervised learning where you actually take this data, look at the behavior of each microservice, and then, as Shlomo pointed out, the interlinking of them, which is all deduced from the data. That's the beauty of it. And then from that, you create this model that knows essentially how to scale for different workloads, for different, I should say, loads to the application, how to scale individual workloads to the right amount to achieve the objective for the entire application, the SLO for the entire application. And this is an innovative approach, which I've not seen anybody else do. And we are very happy to bring this to the market and help solve real problems, as you pointed out, Dheeraj, so people don't need to worry about what knobs to set and how much to set it to and so on, to achieve a particular objective. And this is specifically exactly what ML is suited for, to be able to take a lot of behavioral data and then to actually crunch through that and then work on it, and do something about it. So that's really what we try to do.
And so we're working with you. You always talk about the human element, right? The human element of taking production data, right? And there's lots of it, and lots of moving parts, lots of logs, lots of metrics, and then having to make sense out of it, right? I mean, using that to simulate the same thing, so you can performance tune and make sure that you meet an SLA. That's a lot of work, and it's usually work for your most talented individuals, right? Usually you're the smartest developers, your smartest SREs, and the DevOps people that you put on this task. Which, I mean, just kind of digging into my own my past when I was an engineer and doing performance tuning for production, it's exciting, but it's very hard to do it again and again.
I generally go towards the idea that people who are extremely talented shouldn't face consequences for being a hero. You shouldn't need a hero. They should be a hero infrequently. And that's how we should be using talent. I think it's a mindset change that's needed within the market. So I take it as a simple analogy. When you rent a car, you use it and you forecast how much you're going to need. And then you return the car when you're done. But when you run this in the cloud, what essentially we do is, well, I'll scale it up so I don't have issues, so I don't have to deal with it, because I don't really know how the downstream effect will be. So I'll make it bigger. Okay, I'll make it bigger. So the car's sitting in your driveway, empty for a long time, not being utilized. You don't know how many you need in your fleet for your team. I don't think it's effective for the financials, for the environment, for the climate, because you're using more resources than you need. I think fundamentally our mindset should be these resources, while they are scalable, and cloud native does a fantastic job going vertically and horizontally, it actually can allow us to be extremely inefficient and prevent us from becoming efficient. So that is where I think your models and how it learns how the behavior should be, it will react much more predictively than the horizontal pod autoscalers that exist in market today, which are highly ineffective. From our vantage point, from a vendor vantage point, it's fantastic. You use more resources. So in this circumstance, I think this is more human element, environment element, business element. It's just all around fantastic.
Awesome. Actually, I was about to go sell my 7-seater car that only used 20 times a year with all 7 people sitting in it. I think that's a pretty good way to compare with what's actually happening in the cloud, right? We're putting out resources that we barely use most of the time. And auto scaling and meeting SLAs is a real problem out there. And maybe just to put a little bit of a real context to it, why is this important? Meeting an SLA, having enough time to your business.
I mean, there's two sides to the importance of protecting the staff that make it happen and the customer's expectations. We all are aware that we don't tolerate much anymore because life's so complicated and stressful. You really don't want things that you use on a regular basis to be inconsistent. It's agitating. You can't change that. That's the society today. The part of the society that's missing is protecting the resources too, which is an oversight. Just because something's seamless to the customer doesn't mean it's seamless to the people that are making it happen. It takes them away from being able to participate, one, in the economy and in their lives. Why it matters to me and why I'm so focused on this is I have had frontline members that this caused significant issues, either weight loss because we didn't have good methods and they were under stress and didn't manage their own mental and physical health, or it can go dark enough where you don't have an ecosystem and you don't have a caring leader and you do something significantly bad to yourself, which I'm aware of members that this has happened. And, you know, I mean, you don't want an in honor or in memory of someone because we just didn't have the right viewpoint on technology or our viewpoint on how we manage systems. Seamless is not seamless to the people who make it happen. That is the part. The customer isn't the only vantage point that you should be looking at.
That's actually a really important way to look at it. I will personally acknowledge I haven't really looked at it from the angle, the human element of it. I mean, I've been kind of so focused on elements of running this more efficiently, wastage, right? I think we actually invested also understanding what is the consequence of how we operate in the cloud to carbon footprint. But I think it's actually equally or maybe even more important, the aspect you bring in about the stress it brings to people, right? About dealing with so much data, and it's an increasing amount of data, increasing amount of scale at which applications are being deployed. Raj, I was kind of curious how this translates to, right? I mean, we're taking really what a normal intelligent SREs engineers do to tune the system and use AI, especially reinforcement learning, to kind of do the same thing to alleviate the stress and the need to do repetitive tasks, right? Because that repetition needs to happen every time you put out a new release, every time you change infrastructure, every time any layer in the stack is changed, right? Because what's expected, like Shlomo, you talk about, is there's an expectation that everything will be up all the time. And that seems normal from an expectation perspective, but delivering it, on the other hand, can be very stressful, right? So, Raj, do you want to comment on how we're using reinforcement learning to kind of alleviate the human element?
Yeah, so at the outset, obviously, what we're doing is sort of what we've trained this model to do, and that requires data. So it requires all of this application behavioral observation data that we're getting from sources like Datadog or Dynatrace or Neuralink, or whatever be the APM. But then we're combining that with infrastructure metrics, and then we are training. So it's a supervised training. So we're training it, and we have designed a reward function, for that bot, and then we train it. Within the environment we train it, we are, by the way, there are some assumptions. We're hoping that the data that we got is good, because again, that's a key element for RL or any AI for that matter, and that within that data, you've seen the spikes, and we have seen the model is able to learn how each of these microservices pods operate within that environment we're in. Okay, so that, in other words, how it scales up and down for different loads, and then from this data, this model is then able to be trained to follow a path where it will get the maximum reward. So the reward can be, again, whatever you choose it to be. I mean, if it is a specific SLO in terms of failure percentage, or if it's a SLO in terms of latency, whatever be, or it can be a combination. And that's the beauty of AI, is that you can add whatever be the objectives you want. You then train it, and once that has converged, then now that model can essentially, it does what a human would have done, but of course, removing the stress. So the idea is that the human doesn't have to be, right? But you want it to be like what a human would normally have done. It is mimicking that, right? It's trying to do that. Now, it's not like able to do root cause analysis and all of that. I mean, that's not what it's meant to do. And there are other tools for that kind of thing. But at least it'll relieve the stress of otherwise, which you'll be subjecting a human to, and to juggle all these things without the proper tools. So we wanted to bring a tool to the market that'll actually help somebody, that can help, in this case, the SREs. And it's an augmentation. Think of it as an augmentation for human, so to help them relieve the stress and do something easily. And that's really the goal, and I believe that should be the goal of all AI. It's not to replace, it'll never replace a human, but it'll help relieve their stress and give them a much better way of dealing with the problems. And as you pointed out, a complicated and even more complicated landscape that we're seeing day by day, how to deal with that. So that is really the main purpose of this, and then to make sure that this is useful for somebody like Shlomo with his problem set that he's dealing with.
I would interpret those SLOs, I hope you don't mind me interrupting a little bit, the SLOs as developer happiness or SRE happiness. I know there's the business measurement, but I think with like DORA and the ability to measure DevOps in organizations, they're actually heading towards burden and pain. And then correcting processes. I think you're natively doing that. So like if I send chills when I say min and max replicas, and if that causes stress to you, you're running an organization right now that needs to work on how can I make that not a scary thing to change. I need that to be a machine that knows this is what the ratios need to be. Here's where it's optimal for this amount of events, this amount of customers. And then from my side, my SLO as a technology leader is focused on the staff. Yes, the customers, but that's the byproduct. I'm also worried about the staff because they make it happen. They sustain it. Technology doesn't sustain our applications and the innovation. People do. So I like setting the SLOs as how impactful is it on the team. Like we have a long way to go. Don't get me wrong. It's nice to be very positive when you're facing challenge, but also to be realistic and recognize where you are today. So it's a lot of work for a lot of organizations. I'm not aware of many that can scale and not fall over when they have Black Friday or something like that. It's very challenging. This is where it'd be very helpful.
Yeah, actually, I love the concept of SLOs as human outcomes as well, right? Not just business and technology outcomes, usually measured as uptime, error percentage rates. You're talking more about how often did you have to wake up an SRO, an SRE, right?
Devs too, don't get me wrong, like organizations today will use any talent that can bring them back. Like when an emergency occurs, it doesn't matter who's on call, you will come together and make it happen. Now the draw on the team aggregatively is quite high when you do things like that. So there is a side to it, which is when events aren't managed where SMEs are assigned, it's ping pong and you wake lots of people. So I think the issue is compounding itself, where you have an issue, I have to get people to do things for us to scale. At the same time, when issues occur, I also don't always have the right person engaged. So you have to tackle both of these things if you really want to solve this issue. Scale using technology that can predict, but also make sure that when issues do occur, regardless of technology, you get the right person engaged so the minimal amount of people are impacted by unexpected pressures.
Right. No, that's a good, very, very good point. In terms of without using reinforcement learning or AI tools, what does that do to people, right? In terms of having to produce an SLO or SR and an SLE, not from the human perspective, but from a business outcome perspective. I think people often talk about the compromises we're having to make, right? Without having tools that help you make those decisions quicker and faster, right? And have to deal with these data delusions.
I generally say we're conservative in nature when it comes to customer risk. You'll go big. So if you're in an issue and you want to recover, I'm not going to go with what I think it's going to work. I'm going to go 5 times what I think is going to work so I can recover and make sure I'm okay, because nobody wants the issue to continue. That's for 2 reasons. 1, lack of confidence. And 2, it sometimes makes sense when you have lack of confidence to go big, because it's not savings you're after, it's the customer experience. Like the customer comes first, and I think most people understand that circumstance, but it makes us react inefficiently. Sometimes overreacting causes a cascading event. Let's say I go big because I don't know, then a downstream issue, you hit connection limits, or you hit your project limits. Oh, I can't scale that big now, the project's full, I can't scale more nodes. So you inadvertently cause more issues by trying to be conservative when you lack confidence. So I think as long as technology is giving you confidence as well as a response, it becomes a trust model there, and then you don't overreact and cause a cascading event. So this happens when the most experienced come in. You find new issues because of your response to be protective of your organization and protective of your customers. It's an overreaction, which is justified, but it can cascade to more problems for yourself and the customer itself.
I'm smiling just because it kind of resonates. I've seen it happen more than once, where people either over provision and also hit the problem you talk about, right? When you over provision in one place, you open up another front. It's an inadvertent side effect, but it's also making the complexity more difficult to handle.
Just one last piece is, for a person that needs to react and do this, life can be shit, to be very frank, and I've used that term before. And the context behind it is technology should be facilitating tasks that we shouldn't need to do to deliver value. And the things you're working on does specifically that. You have to understand that the hero's job, while it is respected and rewarded, which technically you should try not to do because you're reinforcing behaviors that are hurting a person you care about, you have to realize that when you teach in the market, log in, run these commands, you're wrong. What's the process I need so that I don't need to do that is really what we should be doing. And using technology is similar to your approach, actually facilitates, again, changing the market's approach. Teaching everybody to do everything themselves isn't what we need. They need to understand it, but they shouldn't be doing it themselves. They need to separate or create 1 degree of separation from delivering value and their personal time, which should be somewhat, a reward to doing good work.
Yeah, it's almost like it's fear that's driving us instead of confidence, right? And I think there's an important element when we talk about smart scaler and reinforcement learning, is how it also accelerates our features to market as a side effect, right? Because it makes you more confident. It makes you more sure about the changes you will deliver, because you know that instead of using that human capital to kind of debug issues and kind of do the performance tuning, every time there's some change in any place, you kind of leverage RL to do that work. Raj, can you talk about how that's another aspect, right? Is how it accelerates feature development instead of people kind of.
That's a very good point. I mean, because for example, there are different angles to that. One particularly is that if you were to do it by hand, what this is doing, you literally have to have a performance tuning team, and that it's that is dedicated to looking at this in a test environment, running all these things. And you have to do this repeatedly. Like every time there's a change in the software, again, this whole team has to get together and then start testing this and then making sure that they know how it behaves. But actually, what's even more difficult is that after they do all that, and let's say they learned it, how do they implement it? And this is the thing where I think Shlomo had also pointed out, like when an event happens or when there is a need to deal with this, they have to keep changing all these things, and it can be harrowing, to do it in real time, uh, hoping that you're doing all the right thing, because it's a human element, right? You can make a mistake, and there's so much anxiety also at that time. So the point is, you really need a tool that can do this for you. And one of the things that we also do is, as part of our validation, to build the trust, because AI, everybody has a fear that that what if it goes off the rails and it's not doing right. So we have a feature where you can actually tell it to not do anything, but just show the recommendations that it's going to do. You feel comfortable, like, okay, this seems to be working, so let me go and implement it. So that trust is built. And then back to your point, Dheeraj, when you go from one release to another, if things have changed, well, you don't need to go and further retune it, because it actually knows how to cope with it. So that's the other beauty of it. And there's always the element of retraining, but and when, let's say, you reach a certain threshold, it will let you know that, look, I am ready to get retrained. You hit a button and it goes off and does the retraining, and then you have the new model. So it's a iterative thing, which is great, and that's part of what AI also brings to the equation, right? The ability to continuously adapt.
So there was,
One sec, I want to make a contradiction, not in the sense of not correct, but for performance and new releases, I generally follow the principle of know when you degrade, know when you break. So I would turn it off. I would use it to match prod. So the challenge most teams have is environments drift, which, because they persist, which they shouldn't, we don't need to get into that today, but because they persist, they drift. So I would say, I'm ready to do a performance test. Hey, AI, what's in prod? Match it to non-prod. Okay, now let's slam that system with that new release and performance run until I degrade. The APM tells me, okay, you're degraded. And then on top of that, you have the second, instead of not degraded, down. I want to crush each pod distinctly. So this service crashes at this amount of users. This service crashes at this amount of users. I don't really want to teach it anything about that. I want just to know the limits so I can be aware of it. It'll obviously scale in prod, but those limits are hard to the app. It's not the scaling. It's the app has an architectural limit. You're doing your best until the architecture fails. Architectures will fail. There will be limitations to the cloud provider, the SaaS services. Everything that you're using has a limit. You'll do the best for hitting those limits, but finding out those limits are also really important so you can alert on them. That Avesha can't help you in those scenarios. You're going to hit an architectural limit. Don't hit it, alert before it, an SLO for that, and then re-architect your app for that scale. And then Avesha will scale you again.
Absolutely. So that's part of the process we have is we have this thing called the pod capacity estimator, and it's specifically built to do that. That is to tell you what are the limits for each of these microservices. So usually, but again, understanding why you hit that limit, that is beyond our capacity. I mean, that is the job of the architect to actually figure it out.
And you would see that within your APM as well, where you're bounded by something, either connection limit, instance limit, whatever it is that you have. You'll see that occur.
Raj, maybe just digging a little deeper into this one. I love how you explain how RL does its function. So when we use Smart Scaler, right, we're using reinforcement learning, which kind of is a shift in paradigm. Right? Typically, we used to, at least from an engineer's perspective, the pattern is you kind of test and then tweak the system, with an expected SLA in your mind, right? I want to have this much uptime, this much response times, and so many errors per second. And then typically that involves doing a lot of like testing, right? You put up scenarios, you kind of run a suite of tests and then start tweaking them. And then as you tweak, you need to keep running those tests, right? It's a laborious task. But when you use reinforcement learning to kind of do the same thing and learn the model, it's not only doing that, but it also understands both the traffic that's coming for this specific service application or that whole service map, but it's also understanding how that application behaves as the load changes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's understanding the pattern of traffic coming in. So I was having this conversation with the customer yesterday. It's like, hey, will you be able to tell if I'm having a denial of service attack or is this normal traffic? Right. This is an interesting topic where I think reinforcement learning can also kind of do some of the things that humans can do, but you have to be always like 24/7 looking for it. Right. So do you want to talk a little bit about deviating from like when things start to deviate from what it's learned?
Yeah, definitely. So a couple of things. I mean, that is an interesting comment about, when we detect that you're actually operating in a zone that's beyond what you originally learned, which is like, we certainly can detect it. At the moment, we are not doing anything with that other than reporting it or, logging it. Because the reason being that what we found is, with regular HPA, it is not that efficient at all. So with our model, even when you're off what you trained it with, it still performs way better than HPA. And that is what we have seen in practice, mostly because it knows the dependencies, just like Shlomo had pointed out, like he calls it the ratios of how much you have to scale. It knows this thing. It inherently knows that. That's part of what it learned from the data that it saw. So it can do a much better job of scaling than what HPA can do. So because HPA is operating in a dumb way, it's just a hard threshold, and then it doesn't know what to do with that. So, but back to your point about the denial of service, I mean, that's a really interesting angle where, down the road we are just scratching the surface with this reinforcement learning approach, but I think there's a lot more that can be done and will be done, in this area in the future.
So just back to how painful is the decision about cost versus availability?
I mean, most organizations that are using Kubernetes have already recognized that technology is the core to delivering value to customers. So they know the spend is occurring and they're doing it, right? So I think organizations, when economies change, will focus on efficiencies as need, and in growth periods, adopt as much technology as possible to become more resilient when new business pressures come. It's just a logical path to follow. And I think most organizations do it. We're trying to target the best customer or patron experience, period. Do we want to do efficiencies? Sure. Are we doing efficiencies? Yes. The challenge is the seamlessness that we're doing also needs to advance more and more towards helping our resources maintain the best life they can possibly have, meaning less and less incidences, less and less work that is menial, less and less repetitive tasks. Nobody wants to be hoodwinked into doing something that is just meaningless for a talent. So the Terrible Trivium, I don't know if everybody's seen that, but if you look up the Terrible Trivium, his superpower is to convince people to do repetitive tasks that have no value. I'm not sure it's a superpower. It's pretty much evil. But we have that today. We have that mentality today that I maintain my value by doing more and more work. No, you maintain your value by being creative and innovative. And organizations gain value when it persists without you. That is, none of us persist. So why are we following a model where everything's tied to the person who isn't going to persist? And the way we operate, you're going to persist very short periods of time because you're burning yourself out and the market is utilizing your talent. So try to become much more resilient within that mindset. But yeah, the terrible trivium actually does happen today. It's our ego. Our ego convinces us that we need to do this to be valued, but it's just tricking us like the terrible trivium.
I'm trying to visualize a cage that I built for myself, right? The cage called, I'm so good at it, I'm going to continue to do it. And it kind of binds you down instead of freeing you up to do more meaningful, more impactful things.
Agreed.
Do you particularly see this problem just for the space you're operating in it? Does it apply to other verticals? Is this a problem a more like germane to like other industries as well?
I am a person that people who know me, I'm quite frank and honest and transparent. In my previous role, I've worked for and with many of the top organizations in North America, and that had nothing to do with myself. I either provided a service or I chose them because I thought it would be a good career choice, and it was. I can come up using my hands how many organizations that are operating where they're protecting their talent pool. So I think the way that it's operating today, it's been exacerbated by cloud because we had constraints before. The constraints was, this is what I bought and I have lead time to buy it, so make it work within here. And then build more resilience because there's no easy solution out. So I always follow some principles within where I operate and where I work is I'm going to create fake constraints, pretend constraints, and you need to live within those so that we change our practices even though the pressures don't exist. Mm-hmm. How many organizations, the best, have the same problems? And I mean the best. I'm not going to list them off. I mean the top tech that you think is phenomenal have the same issues with their talent pool, the same silos that occur, the same challenges for their the people who are front lines. What I find really ironic is that, and I'm not trying to diminish one or the other, frontline workers for healthcare understood burnout.
Yep.
Technology, who talks about it? Technology burnout. People who are making all the apps you use to run your day and just make things happen, bring food to your table, essentially is a frontline worker too. They may be a dev, they may be an SRE, they may be an operations person, they may be app ops, whatever you want to call them. They are frontline and they take a lot of heat, and technology should be catering to them just as we do for other types of burnout.
Yeah, we expect our banking systems to work all the time. We expect our medical services to work all the time. There's technology behind every one of them, and there's engineers and SREs and DevOps people that are making sure that that happens. But you're right, nobody really talks about that kind of burnout, which is, I guess, hidden away, right? There's no face that kind of the public looks at when it comes to that stuff.
Oh, I think we have a question.
Of course. Oh, this is an excellent question, actually. How much data does AI need to do the training?
Yeah, so
I'll
answer that. It depends on essentially how much variability you see in your traffic patterns. So typically what we have seen is it's like if you have a week's worth of data, that is enough to get the model trained, and then you can go from there. And then as it needs more retraining over time, you can get, you continuously keep getting even more data along the way, and that is enough to get it going. So it's just a simple matter of you deciding, what is the variability and pattern that you're trying to learn. So.
I'll comment on that as well. Like we see that within APM learning too. And its intent is make sure you have enough data where your repeat patterns, what those variability is. So for example, if you're indexing logs for 7 days, but you have an instance that happens in 9, you need to go and collect more logs because it won't be able to capture that anomaly. I would think the same would apply to any machine learning. You need to make sure your data set's long enough to facilitate a time space of pattern that is consistent. So a week could be 9 days. You'd figure that out based on knowing what your traffic patterns are today. You could look at Cloudflare, CloudFront, things like that to see if you have any common distribution that occurs. And then as long as you capture that for Avesha, I think it would do a fantastic job.
Yeah, perfect. I think, yeah, that's kind of how we look at it when customers ask that question is, what does your pattern look like? Right? A lot of customers actually have a daily pattern, right? Where the traffic peaks at lunchtime, on the way to home, people might call in for the service, or maybe right after they have dinner, right? So there's usually a lot of customers that have a daily pattern, but then there's other customers that have weekly. It's important for us to have at least one pattern set, right? So it could be daily, weekly, in some instances monthly, and that's sufficient enough, right, Raj, to do the cleaning.
Yeah. And then there's I think a couple of other questions, Dheeraj.
So there's an AOps. Is this an AI ops remediation tool? I find that because I was looking into Avesha as well in the past, and I follow the practice that remediation from an AI perspective is the AI ops did the wrong job. You shouldn't have had that incident in the first place. So if you're predictive towards the issue, you would have scaled correctly and prevented the issue. So proactive, yes. Is it AI ops a proactive tool? Yes. Remediation, you can speak to it, Raj, but I kind of feel like you're a proactive AI ops.
It's a predictive, yeah, it's a proactive or predictive intelligent remediation. You can think of it that way. And that's exactly right. And I think there was another question about, whether the application, what do we observe from application behavior? So essentially, we're looking at anything that is important for this model to learn from. So whether it is failure rates, whether it's latency, whether it is, and obviously, requests per second as the load. So these are all things that we look at from the APM tools. And errors that you're seeing, right? The HTTP return codes, all these matter. In addition to, of course, the infrastructure metrics. So all these we are taking into account, and then we're looking at the number of pods that were scaled, and it is all per microservice within the environment. And then we apply the filtering, to remove some, to take into account the service graph and all those things. So there's a series of filters and cleaning that we have to do before we can build these models. And then all this is automated, of course. All you need is this. It's a SaaS, so this data is sent up to our SaaS where it is cleaned, and then you train with those. It is used to train the models, and then you then send down the results. It uses actually CADA as the actual tool that does the scaling, but then it informs CADA what it has to scale to. So it's a very simple SaaS setup. So it's very easy to do.
I think the service map is critical. I don't think people realize how difficult it is to have a service that failed first. So I always find that the incident is one service failed first based on load. Others will fail too when you scale up the one that failed first. Without that service map, it's extremely difficult to manage inbound because teams have learned over time that if I scale this one, I know this one's going to go next. And then you have all of these sync things within Argo CD or whatever you're doing. You're trying to make sure you get all of them at the same time so you don't cause another service to be the next point of failure based on load. So I think that service map is very critical to help customers manage this. And I think that value in itself, irrespective of all the others, make things a lot easier to manage when it comes to which one's going to fail next.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, especially in the context of microservices, right? Because there's a lot of services that you're managing, and they have interdependencies, and scaling one doesn't necessarily mean you've solved where you
I wonder. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No. Go ahead. Shlomo.
I was going to say, I wonder if Best Buy is watching. They should reach out.
I hope they
I won't comment why, but I know they should reach out.
So there's another question that came in. Is there a reliability breaking load? to worry about?
I think, Raj, you spoke to it where you had those pod sizing service. I think that would be reference to, at this point, this is what you should be, and this is where you'll break. Obviously, it's going to try to react. And the way I interpret that question is, what happens if it continues to react to keep things safe beyond the thresholds of the system can manage, meaning you'll actually hit our architectural limit? I think that will happen. But you can speak to it. I don't know how you would prevent this. You're obviously trying to stay up, but if it goes beyond the physical limitations, then you might actually go into that scenario unless you hard code that to prevent it.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously, if it's completely broken, then beyond a certain point, then you're not going to be able to achieve whatever SLO. And
exactly,
we have mechanisms to send alerts and through Slack and all the other mechanisms that people normally expect, to let them know that you've literally hit a limit. And this you will know even beforehand. You will know as a report from us. These are the limits of your current microservices. And if you're trying to go beyond this, and I think Dheeraj had touched on that in the past, one of the questions, like you could take note of that from that report, and you can actually do something about it even ahead of time. Like when you look at that and say, oh God, this is bottlenecked. There's nothing we can do beyond this level of loading because there's an architectural limit. And I need to go back to my engineer and tell them, look, we got to fix this. So that is actually a very useful output for you guys, I would imagine, Shlomo, right?
I mean, from our side, bad is bad. You need to know it's bad. So I kind of feel like if that's the issue I'm dealing with, is finding my architectural limits so that I redesign to make us scale more customers imagined. I'd love that. That's much better than saying, how do I manage basic load when it changes and fluctuates and be efficient with it? I would prefer to go to the point where customers are loading our system 200%. Look, the score is growing fast. So we are the organization that's 100% plus per year in growth. And under that context, that's great. Bring it. And we will change our architecture and know where our architecture limits are because we're growing, and growth is a good thing. Growth on a daily basis affecting you is silliness. Like that's just silliness. You should not be affecting your teams so frequently. But when you hit your architectural limits, okay, I learned my lesson. Guys, let's take that Jira or whatever ticket you're using to track your needs for planning and build that product priority. I have a physical limit on my application, irrespective of everything else. Let's fix that versus what's wrong. I don't know which service is failing because of the other and the ratios are wrong. It's kind of removing all the confounding variables and saying your architecture needs to be fixed.
Yeah.
I have no problem with failure when it comes to the limitations of architecture. We will fix the architecture then.
Yeah. So go ahead, Raj. I'm sorry.
No, and I was just saying that in the past, where Shlomo had said there are some events that cause spikes that can go way more than what was expected. So you need to know, right, that beyond this point, I have a problem. This thing will not scale because there's a hard bottleneck. And so then
you see it as an additional feature set, right? That reinforcement learning is not only helping you do the scaling in a very efficient way, but it's also kind of highlighting where to focus on as the load grows. Right? It's pointing to places where it might need a re-architecture. Right? It can't solve the architecture problem, but it can definitely kind of put a spotlight on it, so the teams can focus on solving that problem in the next release.
Insights. Insights is always good, regardless of them being bad. Like the nature of it could be bad. You could have a failure. You may not recover. It may take time to come back. But that insight's key. It's the confounding issues that ruin your ability to adapt. By having this, we scaled it how it's supposed to scale. This is how it's supposed to be optimized. We hit an upper limit. This is it. This is where your problem is. That's very helpful to remove the inability of teams to figure out where the root cause is. I think this actually helps predetermine it.
Kind of takes the noise out and helps you kind of focus on the areas that needs focus. Just to follow up, and this is a question for both of you, in terms of how much data do I need? The question is, how easy should it be to try SmartScaler on an application that you already have running in production? And the counter question to Raj is, how easy is it? So, Shlomo, back to you. Like, what's your
yeah, so I generally, if you have a Kubernetes cluster, be it EKS, AKS, GKE, Anthos, whatever it is, you'll run on any cloud native platform. The context is try it and see if you optimize your clusters. Does it give you insights that you currently don't have? I mean, a deployment in Kubernetes is, once you're using it frequently, it's quite fast and simple, right? It's not like you need a VM to come up and wait for an OS to work. The nodes are running. You deploy image into the container platform and you're running. So I see it as an easy task. What you find may not be the easy task, which is to articulate to the business why it's running so much smaller than before. Why was your operational budget dropping? Why were we so off on our ratios? Why were we not reacting correctly before? I think those are all self-awareness and self-reflection that will follow after trying it out.
Cool. And Raj, question to you. How easy is it for a customer, a new company that has a Kubernetes workload to try SmartScaler?
Yeah, I mean, it's logistically, it's very, very simple. It's a matter of, essentially it's a call out, from your cluster to our SaaS, sending it the data it needs, and then getting back the recommendations. But then again, the data should be good. And so that is if you don't really have a need for this, like you have, let's say, very low loading, and it's not really a problem for you, this is not the right tool. I mean, it's just a waste of time. But if you have a situation where you really have to find, you have a varying load, you really don't know how to deal with this, and it's a complicated matter. You really have to use such tools to help deal with this, rather than just running around, with this data and you don't know what to do with that data. That's not a great situation. So I think that's all it is. So and there are a lot of, I think Shlomo has already said, right, there are a lot of organizations in different verticals. I'm sure in his own vertical, in the finance vertical we've seen, and then also in the retail space, anything that has a B2C component, and if it's a hot property, you're going to see these unpredictable, loading, and you don't know what to do about it, and that's the best situation for where this will work the best. In fact, what we've seen is the more heavy the loading and the more unpredictable, the more useful this tool is, and that we've seen savings even in, I mean, from a cost standpoint, we've seen a lot of savings because people just over provision and try to think that the problem goes away, but it doesn't. And even in that, we've been able to reduce a lot of work from almost 70% in some cases, and sometimes 40%. So, but the biggest benefit is really the getting a little bit of control over the situation and getting your guys, have more of a balanced and a mature way of dealing with this sort of complexity.
I think any organization that's affected by events or news would benefit, because those cause unpredictable scenarios. So, for example, players traded, Kevin Durant is traded, or Kobe Bryant is traded. That can cause a huge fluctuation because it's chatter. People want to know. People want to get involved. They want to be a part of that community, and that community can be huge. It can be millions of people. So I think you could also distinguish the verticals based on, are you affected outside by environmental changes such as news or events that are known to the community. It would be advantageous for you to use a service like this, because unpredictable becomes predictable in your circumstance, and it's trained. So it's advantageous, and I think those are those in the most need, because we keep perceiving unpredictable as, oh, I didn't know that would happen. That's not true at all. I didn't know it was going to be so big, But if I had a learning model to handle my scaling properly, even though it went big, it managed it because it knows how to handle big. All I'm suggesting is you can actually, the unplanned events become a natural response, and unplanned becomes managed, which organizations should be striving to do, because business pressure is not usually in your control. It's usually unplanned, and you should be resilient to it.
So that kind of touches on the topic of outliers, right? How outliers kind of decide our behavior when it comes to auto scaling or provisioning, and how, Raj, maybe you want to touch on how outliers are dealt with in reinforcement learning models.
Yeah, I mean, when you mean, I think what you mean by outliers are, like some things in your data set that are sort of really out of the. So there is a, obviously when we take in the data set for the training, we do a process of cleaning and all that, and so there's a set of well-established AI procedures for dealing with that. It's all, at the end of the day, there's no magic to this. It's just a statistical problem, right? We're trying to use different methods to accurately describe, what we're seeing in statistics, and so outliers are an issue that we have to deal with. And then, as sometimes you have to do, like in the case of latency and so on, there are different. Like there's a P95, for example, where you can use that to get to the range of latency that you care about. You can't like keep looking at, I mean, so there are, in other words, established procedures for handling this. So we do that, and that's how we get a good model. And then, of course, during the inferencing, if you see something strange, I mean, again, it depends on what you want to do, how you want to deal with it. If it is a legitimate traffic and you want to actually scale to that, and as the case might be, then you would respond to it, because that's what you want to do. But then I think it varies from different organizations, and so we.
Cool. So just final two questions, Shlomo. I mean, you see this as an industry-wide problem in terms of over provisioning for auto scaling, and I have a really important question for Raj after that one.
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear a question. I do think it is a big problem for most industries. Not so much over provisioning. I think it's just the weight that teams bear to make things seamless for customers, and overlooking their needs is my driver. We can't overlook talent. We need to protect them, and whatever's available in market, you should work with these organizations to help your organization, which is why we've made that connection. I recognize the value within the technology and how it could help the team I care about, or the teams I care about. So it was a natural partnering.
Question for Raj. What is on the board behind you? I'm suspecting it must be your next invention.
I actually am not in my room, in my colleague's room, and I can only think of maybe it's something that he's thinking about. So it's something else, not unrelated to this topic. So.
Awesome. Any takeaway thoughts from you, Raj, before we?
No, I think it's been awesome. I think thanks for sharing your insights, Shlomo. I mean, we believe we are on a great journey to help the teams, your teams and others, to bring some sanity around the issues they're dealing with using AI and some of the new techniques, and to help ease their workloads and make it a more pleasant experience for them. And we're very happy to be part of that and partner with companies like yours to make this real. So,
thanks.
Awesome. This was an exceptionally insightful session. Thank you, Shlomo. Thank you, Raj. And thank you, everyone, for joining and listening to us. Please reach out to us if you have similar challenges that AI can help leverage and kind of help you alleviate some of the problems, right, that people face in delivering SLOs in the real world.
And there's a QR code if you want to get in touch with us. So feel free to go scan that. All right.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.